Welcome to Lecture 5, The Revolutionary Republic, 1775 to 1783, in which we carry forward the story of American independence, starting with the decision to break away from England and ending with the end of the Revolutionary War itself. We begin with the Second Continental Congress, which met in June of 1775 and decided to appoint General George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. There's a need for an army because there's already been fighting between British and American forces, and so there's a need to organize and prepare for defense of the colonies. Curiously enough, there's a decision at the Continental Congress to invade Canada under the assumption that the poor Canadians would just really like to be freed from British tyranny, and then they would be so enthusiastic to join with the United States in fighting the British overlords. Actually turns out to be a huge disaster and a blunder. Every invasion of Canada by Americans turns out to be a disaster and blunder. But there's one final attempt for the colonies to remain British. That is to say, please don't make us leave the empire. We like being British. We like our scones. We like our spot of tea in the afternoon. We like our British traditions and our laws. Please don't push us out. We give you one last chance. In July of 1775, this last-ditch effort was known as the Olive Branch Petition, and it was an attempt to appeal directly to the king to let the colonies stay, work out their differences. He refused to read it, which pretty much sealed the idea that the colonists were inching closer and closer to independence. By January of 1776, lots of people were talking about independence. Should we stay? Should we go? What should Americans do? And one of the people who had some thoughts about this issue was a recent migrant from Britain named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a working class fellow who wrote a very short pamphlet called Common Sense. And in it, he just says America should be independent. And he offers, what he says, are words of wisdom, just good common sense, why independence makes good sense. His argument is that the colonies are too far away to be governed by an island that doesn't understand them. Monarchy is a ridiculous form of government. And a lot of people are convinced by Paine's arguments. He writes in a very plain, ordinary style, which appeals to a lot of readers, and so Common Sense is a pretty good bestseller at promoting the idea of independence from Britain. Closer to that idea of independence is the recommendation in May of 1776 that the states, not the colonies, because now we're going to be states from here on out, write new constitutions. And pretty much, there's no way you can go back. If you're writing a new frame of government and you're preparing to govern yourself, well, you are really independent. There's no way to get around that. You are, in fact, acting independent, whether you've declared your independence or not. The Declaration itself comes in July of 1776. That Declaration of Independence, which was pretty much signed by everybody by August of that year, makes a very clear argument about why America is seeking its freedom. There's a long list of complaints that directly blame King George III. He is named as the principal offender in pushing the colonies out. But it also begins with a very clear description of Enlightenment principles, Enlightenment ideas that are supporting the colonists' desire to leave Britain. Now, I should note here, the Declaration of Independence is not a frame of government. It literally is, we're just going to be independent now. Thank you very much. It doesn't actually create a structure to govern. That's going to come the next year. So here is Tom Paine's title page for Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America. And he pretty much lays it out there. He thinks that independence makes sense. He says, I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I dare you, I triple dog dare you, to prove that America should stick with the British. In that Declaration of Independence, it says famously that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Are all men? Did Jefferson really mean all men? Because we are talking about a country, soon to be nation, that is founded and supported largely by the work of slaves, particularly in the South, but there are slaves in every single colony, not just the South. So we have to think about this country declaring its freedom and the equality of all men, and how does that square with the reality of that some people are more equal than others? Well, that reality becomes pretty clear when the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation. And that proclamation says that any slave who would run away from his master and join the British Army would be given his freedom. So here's Dunmore on the left here. And Dunmore is essentially calling the colonists out to say, look, you say that you are fighting for your rights and your liberties and your freedoms. Well, I'm going to test your commitment to those ideas, and I'm going to offer freedom to runaway slaves. Now, some do take Dunmore up and do take the British up on their on these ideas of fighting for Britain. Roughly about 4,000 slaves do end up fighting for the British, putting on a uniform and serving the British masters. Southerners are incredibly fearful of these runaway slaves because they're afraid that in the middle of the night their slaves are suddenly going to catch the British fever of freedom and maybe slit their throats and sneak off. Southerners also accuse the British of stirring up the Indians against the colonists. So when you look at the development of the revolutionary movement in the South, particularly 1775 and 1776, there are a lot of rumors about slaves and Indians being a threat to colonists. And there's a recent book that came out called The Common Cause that shows in many ways that the revolutionary freedom movement was based on fear of slaves and Indians. So 4,000 black loyalists fight on the side of the British, but a lot of African Americans simply just run away. While Master is occupied with the war and not paying attention, they take off and they find freedom for themselves. Historian Gary Nash has called the American Revolution the largest slave revolt in American history. Some 100,000 people go missing and disappear total in seeking freedom. Some of those do eventually get returned or find their way back. At the end of the war, 10,000 of those runaway slaves will actually leave with the British and go elsewhere in the British Empire. to try to make a new life for themselves. Now, some of those slaves do fight for the Americans. There are about 5,000 black patriots, like this guy over here on the right, and these black patriots are motivated by the promise of freedom as well. Many of them are told that if they fight for America, they will be freed. And a great number of them are, because they put their lives on the line for the freedom of the colonies. So you might think of the Revolution as raising this issue of slavery in the middle of all this discussion of freedom and independence. And you can see in that questioning of freedom and independence ways that slaves are trying to make this war work for their benefit, whether that's running away, whether that's fighting for Britain or fighting for the colonies. Now, we're not going to do a whole lot of battles. Sorry for you battle lovers out there. Instead, we're going to skip straight on into diplomacy, because this is a war that America cannot win without help. I know we like to romanticize America's victory in this war and celebrate all the hard work that the colonists did to achieve their freedom, and they did. There's a lot going on there. But they couldn't have done it without foreign aid. And the biggest supporter is actually the French. The French didn't initially support the colonies because they wanted to see if the colonies could do it on their own. Could they be successful without help? And so in 1777 there is a battle, Saratoga, which happens in the north. And Saratoga is a astounding victory for the colonists. And the French are like, okay, Americans, they have a chance at winning. We will give a full help to the Americans now. Now, you might think, oh, that's so sweet. Thanks, French. Merci, thank you. It's so awesome. But we should also keep in mind that the French are out to weaken their old enemy, Britain, and not just their love for Americans. Americans also get loans from the Dutch. The Dutch are the great bankers of the world, and the Dutch provide a lot of the capital needed to fund the war. Wars are not cheap. You got to pay soldiers. You got to feed people. It's expensive. Even with all of this help, by 1779, America's dollar, the continental dollar, pretty much has almost no value at all. America's finances are in a terrible situation because, quite frankly, the colonists are unable to convince people that their efforts are going to work out. And so not everybody trusts the value of American money. People are reluctant to accept it. Inflation has raised prices all over the country as people are trying to buy up war goods, make sure the army can be fed. The economy is really suffering, even with all of this help from France and the Dutch. At the end of the conflict, spoiler alert, America wins. Bet you didn't know that. The United States comes to be all of this area here in this orangey pinky color, everything up to the Mississippi River. Notice that that includes a pretty good amount of territory that would have been claimed by Indians who were not happy that they were not included in treaty negotiations ending the war. But there's also disputed territory where some other countries claim ownership, such as this area down here that's now parts of Alabama and Mississippi. Florida is not part of the U.S. It belongs to Spain. Spain has Louisiana right now. It'll go back to France. And then there's disputed territory over in the West as well. So just because America eventually wins doesn't mean the map is going to look anything like what we think it's going to look like. Speaking of Indians and the Indian story in this war, it's really difficult for native peoples. On the one hand, they don't like the British or the Americans in many cases. They find them both insufferable. Yet, the British have been nicer than the Americans have been. Sometimes the British take up for the Indians and respect Indian rights and Indian treaties and Indian lands, whereas Americans typically do not. So it's a real struggle for Indian communities to figure out whose side they're going to be on. For example, half of the Cherokees fought for Britain. Another half remained neutral, figuring it would be better to be neutral and try not to offend either side. Try not to, get on the bad side of the Americans. Initially, the Iroquois were neutral, but about half of them also came to side with the British, such as this Iroquois chieftain here, shown on the right, Mohawk chieftain Joseph Brant. And this is going to really pose trouble for Indian peoples, because if you pick the British and the Americans in your neighborhood, the Americans are probably going to burn everything you own to the ground, which happens to a lot of the Cherokees. So picking sides, not picking sides, there's no good way for Indians to really come out of this conflict. And so perhaps the best, tactic for Indians is to simply try to stay on everyone's good side and hope that you come out okay after the war is over. Most of us are pretty familiar with the idea that the Revolutionary War occurs over here on the eastern coast. So all those battles we've heard of, Brandywine, Valley Forge, the encampment that happens there, Saratoga, all those places that we all know, Kings Mountain, Camden down here in the south. But there's a great deal of conflict in the American Revolution that happens on the frontier, as Americans are engaging the Indians in conflict, trying to gain control over British forts, trying to shut down native peoples from being helpful to the British. And so you see a lot of conflicts out here on the frontier, way as far, to the west as what would be today Indiana. In the end, Indians don't come out too well from the war, and they're completely and utterly ignored in diplomacy after the war. No one even asks them about their own land claims for these territories. And in fact, most Indians, after the war is over, will say they were never defeated. They were never actually conquered. And so they don't have to give up this land. It doesn't belong to Britain. It belongs to them. Now, I told you that the Declaration of Independence is not a government. We do write a government, and that happens during the war. It's kind of a hasty concoction, in the sense that you don't have a lot of time to think through everything about your government. You got to put something together, hope everybody likes it, and get rolling because you've got a war to fight. So the government of the United States is pretty much almost entirely written by a single guy, who calls it the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union when it's written in 1777. And the ideas behind it are the ideas of, let's create a government that does not have anything remotely like British monarchy in it. Nothing that would be tyrannical or threatening to the states. That is, the Articles of Confederation, or AOC, is a product of the Americans' dissatisfaction with British rule. It creates a very weak central government because, you don't want to be under a strong central government like the British were. No executive power. Once again, you don't want anything that's going to be like a monarch that will be a threat to your rights. No courts. No taxing authority. And of course that one makes sense because the whole of the 1760s and 1770s is all about taxes and can Britain tax. So this AOC really is written in the mindset of avoiding all the mistakes of the English system of government from the colony's perspective. Every state had a single vote in this government, which really reflected this idea that the states were all on equal footing, no matter how big your state was. Rhode Island is just as powerful as Virginia, even though Rhode Island is this pipsqueak of a state. It's not ratified until 1781, partially because there's some conflict over Western land claims. Congress at this time really feels like those states should give up their Western land claims, and those could be given to the national government to create new states out of. And a lot of states are really hesitant to do that until 1781. And finally, everybody gets on board with the idea that they'll give up their Western lands. Now, at the state level, you see much stronger governments and governments that are functioning at least since 1776. Because the belief is state power is more important, and that's where government should be really happening. These state governments also tend to be written in this idea of rejecting anything that's dangerously British. So they all have weak governors. The joke in North Carolina that the only power the governor has is the power to sign a receipt to get his paycheck. Legislatures are strong. In many of the state governments, the courts are not terribly powerful or well defined, so this to prevent the courts from undermining the liberties of the people as well. Every state had its own list of rights, its own Bill of Rights. So Virginia had a Bill of Rights, North Carolina had its own list of rights. And these were designed to put in print everything the colonists believed in as their rights, so that those could not be challenged or taken away in the future. Well, the colonies lasted till 1781, won the war, and then finally signed a treaty in 1783, the Treaty of Paris. This treaty, agreeing to a formal end to the conflict, was pretty successful for the Americans, who got a whole lot of the things they asked for from Britain. They got the Mississippi as the western boundary, which is what they wanted. They got a promise that the British would evacuate western forts, what the British actually didn't do, and continue to hold on to those forts for roughly the next 30 years. The U.S. agreed that any debt owed to the British from before the war would be paid. So if you went into debt in 1775 to a British guy, you got to pay that, because that was a legal debt in 1775. They even agreed to restore loyalist property. So property that had been taken away from people who were loyal to Britain would have a way of getting their property back. That was also not really followed, pretty much. And the debts issue was really hard to sue people to get payment for those debts in many of the states. As late as 1805, Americans are still getting sued for payment of Revolutionary War debts that they owe to the British. Some of these court cases drag on for years. Now, the question is, in my mind, is this a revolution? I mean, in some ways, you've read a lot about revolutions. We've seen attempts at revolution. We've seen rebellions. We've seen riots. And you have to think kind of, what does the word revolution mean? Is it a dramatic, sudden alteration? Is it a complete change in government? Can a revolution be conservative, or does it have to be radical? Well, that kind of a question can be answered in different ways depending on who you are in 1783. In many of my colleagues' minds, it's not a revolution at all. It's an expensive civil war because it's Britain on Britain. It's British versus British people. Just one side calls themselves Americans, but they're still just British people. And so a lot of my colleagues will talk about this as a civil war or a war of colonial independence and less a revolution. And it's pretty expensive. It's $170 million in debt for the United States. France spent roughly $190 million. France actually spent so much money that it bankrupted the French economy and made it very difficult for the French government to be successful at governing. And by 1789, the French will have their own revolution as their government falls apart. Now, what if you're a white dude? What if you're a white man? Well, it is revolutionary in that it's an attack on aristocracy. It's an attack on the idea that there are elite people who must be in charge and must be powerful because they're born special and more special than the rest of us. You see that in the abolition of two very old landholding practices known as entail and primogeniture. These ancient landholding practices tended to concentrate property and power in the hands of a few people, and after the revolution, they are abolished. Entail is abolished. Entail is basically where you can't sell your property at all. It must remain in the family forever. And primogeniture is the practice of willing your property automatically to the firstborn son. So both those things go away, and that opens up landholding to more people. Now, what if you're a woman? Is the revolution revolutionary? Well, you do get a political role. There are women like Deborah Sampson, shown here, who actually fights in the revolution. She puts on a soldier's uniform, goes out there and shoots her musket just like everybody else. She gets wounded. At one point, she's actually digging the bullet out of her own wound in order for people not to figure out that she's a woman, because she didn't want a doctor to examine her. And after the war, she even gets a pension for fighting in this conflict. Not every woman is off fighting like Deborah Sampson is. A lot of women are just simply taking over farms while their husbands are gone. Their decision making is political in that if they buy something British, that says they love Britain. Well, if you really love America, your buying decision should show that you value American products. So that decision is a political one. However, you could see that as a limit, and that a lot of women's political roles were pretty much saddled to their idea of being a consumer. That a woman is a person who buys things, and she should buy American things. And that's the only political, activity she can engage in. There is a questioning of slavery. The first abolitionist societies are founded during the Revolution. The first anti-slavery societies are founded in this time period. And a lot of people are saying, look, if we're talking about equality and freedom and liberty, we need to actually mean that and not own other human beings. And you see a lot of this in the North, particularly among Quakers, who are really, really uncomfortable with the idea of slavery in a land that says it's the land of the free. But there's little action against slavery. Little direct activity during the war to get rid of slavery itself. So the question of this being a revolution is kind of an open one in the sense of it depends on who you are and whether or not what happened was a long-lasting change that dramatically altered your life, or was it a short-term window that opened and you got a little glimpse of a different life, but only for a short time. And I haven't even put Indians on here. And we haven't even talked about class and the people who are lowest in the social ladder. Bringing all those people in the mix kind of opens the idea that the Revolutionary War, this conflict, was more revolutionary for some than it was for others.